What will automotive supply chains look like in the age of electric vehicles? I'm joined today by Rick Kozole. He is Senior Leader of Automotive and Industrials with Alvarez and Marsal. Hello, Rick. How you doing?
I'm good, Robert. Yourself?
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me on this question that really is a big topic of discussion these days in the public, beyond even the automotive community. So I'm just trying to get a sense of how auto manufacturers are rethinking their supply chains today as they transition to the production of electric vehicles. What are some of the big considerations they have to take into account?
Well, I think it's severalfold. One, when you look at the tier one supply base, especially in the driveline area, which ones are evolving, from the ICE platforms to the electric vehicle platforms, and in a sense, which ones are going to make it over time. You'll continue to see lots of investment from the tier ones. You'll see acquisitions as well, and hopefully, most of the supply chain, as quote unquote, will remain intact from a logo perspective, but certainly what they make and do and design is going to be different.
But
The locations. I'm sorry, Robert.
No, go on. Please finish. Please finish.
Yeah, the locations by which they do that may change as well. In the 90s and early 2000s, I was a part of putting a lot of product, in other parts of the world. Now, when they're looking at the supply chains, they look at potential repatriation where possible to reduce supply chain risk.
How much of this is specific, though, to the production of electric vehicles versus how much can you draw on the past lessons in order to retool these supply chains? In what sense are we entering new territory?
Well, I mean, Robert, you have new players coming into play, right? And so you have new entrants. If you look historically, let's just take the past 20 or 30 years, the number of new entrants that are significant from a logo perspective, and that I'd say would be relatively small. And I actually haven't thought that through, but I'm, just
I get the impression.
My guess is that it's a pretty solid hypothesis. But now with the introduction of new technology, you got new players, so there can and will be displacement amongst the current players as we move forward. And I think there's a lot of concentration on driveline. That's certainly the focus here in the next 10 years, really the conversion from ICE to EVs. But there are other areas of the vehicle that will change as well because of it. The compartmentalization that you have of now within the vehicles with the EV platform allows you with different storages. You have different functions and features you can bring to the table, new interior types of mechanisms, et cetera. So whereas it's mainly on driveline right now, I think you're going to still see changes, in other parts of the vehicle as well.
How does it square with a parallel conversation about the resourcing or nearshoring of manufacturing back to North America and in some cases even the United States? Does that affect the EV production line going forward?
Certainly. I mean, that'll come into the play. If you're an OE or tier one right now, you're looking at the potential repatriation of product to reduce risk. Also, obviously, to either reduce costs or increase performance to your customer, which are certainly interrelated. It's an opportunity to do that because you're investing, right? So now you're making the choice of whether to retool, perhaps in China or in the United States or in Mexico. So it's a pivot point when it comes to investment over the next 10 years. I mean, we're doing work for a couple of tier ones right now, looking at those types of topics. So it's hot now.
Yeah, even though this is still in its relatively early stages as we transition toward all electric vehicles, there are some challenges that have already emerged, including in the near term, the lack of semiconductor supply, insufficient semiconductors, questions about sourcing batteries, rare earth minerals needed in the electronics of these vehicles. So are these indeed major challenges, and how do you think that companies are going to position themselves to overcome them?
Yes, they're major challenges. How they will position themselves to overcoming is advanced planning. This was a surprise in the auto industry. I work across industries. I'll tell you, the automotive industry is one of the most advanced, complex, globally integrated supply chains in the world. And they got caught by surprise here. They made a mistake amongst all of them. I think that your advanced supply chain planning mechanisms now will be much more far-reaching. I think that within your product development process, when they're looking at capacity, risk, dual sourcing, et cetera, I think you're going to see much more robust planning to reduce risk going into the future.
When you say they made a mistake, are you referring to cutting back on orders of semiconductor chips and the like when demand was temporarily down for automobiles? Is that what you mean?
No, I think understanding the global capacity and their ability to flex that.
Yeah. One hopes that mistake would translate into a lesson learned for the future. Are you confident that this industry can learn those lessons and not make that same mistake going forward?
Yeah, I think that's what I alluded to earlier. If I wasn't too clear on it, absolutely. Call it a mistake, call it oversight, call it just got caught, right? But the resiliency of the industry, I think, is really strong in the supply chain area. And I think, not only are they going to take care of that issue, which is supposed to alleviate, here in the third quarter to a fair extent, but you can bet that they're looking at other areas of risk right now globally, and not just the auto industry. I think it has certainly looked at, brought up the issue to another, set of industries. I can say previous to this that the defense industry was looking globally at the risk within the supply chain that has developed over years. Okay, and part of that implication is going to be bringing that back, okay, to reduce risk. So from overseas back to the United States. Not all of it, because it's expensive, right, to bring back.
But in terms of like single sourcing situations, a lot of manufacturers in multiple industries are talking about trying to minimize single sourcing engagements so as to avoid the risk of disruptions of those important suppliers going forward. Do you think that automotive manufacturers, OEMs, are going to look to varying their sourcing for that reason going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, in general, the automotive industry does not single source. I mean, there's a lot of dual sourcing. There's a lot of consolidation that's occurred in the top 20 suppliers. But if you look at any of the large OEMs in general, they have 2 or 3 sources for similar items, not same part number, right? But for similar like items where they can make the transition if needed, something catastrophic, but it would take some time. But also to, maintain competition. But I think you'll also see in some areas, perhaps not within the OEMs, perhaps within the tier ones, as select insourcing occurring, which is occurring in other industries, including the aerospace environment, of where the supply base has been threatened or attrited, not just placed overseas, but threatened or attrited, and you're seeing select insourcing occur.
Interesting, because I was going to ask you whether you think that an all EV supply chain would involve a different relationship between the OEM and its various tiers of suppliers, especially the tier ones on which the auto industry has relied so heavily in recent years. So you really do think that there may be some reconfiguration of who makes what, where it comes from, stuff like that?
I do. I think that that reconfiguration will be based on where the OEMs feel where they can grab the value and the margin.
Yeah.
And just said simply and straightforward, right? I mean, in the 80s and 90s, the divestiture of those component divisions, were in a large part due to the variabilization of the cost structure. When volume dropped, you got stuck with a tremendous amount of fixed cost. So, that's the trade-off you make. You may want to bring it back inside, to control, to launch, competitive reasons, et cetera, perhaps some cost savings, but you also then increase your fixed.
Yeah. So it's more than just this idea of this pendulum of strategies. One decade we're doing insourcing, one decade we're doing outsourcing. It sounds like there's some real reasons and some real thinking behind what you're describing.
Yeah, I think if there was a pendulum in the past, like the divestitures from the OEMs, and then the tier ones then starting to place a lot of component operations elsewhere as well as OEMs. I think that was driven by certain forces of the times. I think now there'll be much more of a strategic plan laid out of where are they going to fit over time, both OEM and tier one.
Yeah, well, really interesting to see how it plays out. Rick Kozole of Alvarez and Marsal, thank you so much for giving us an insight into how electric vehicle supply chains might differ and transition in the years ahead. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you. Enjoyed it.